Welcome to this Advisor Insights conversation. Today's topic is advisory councils in portfolios, knowing when, knowing how, and getting it right. And today I'm joined by some seasoned professionals when it comes to portfolio management. To set the tone, the observation that we have is most portfolio owners are lean by design. They're juggling capital, people, growth, risk, and that's across multiple businesses. And yet many delay bringing on advisory support until something breaks. Today, we're unpacking how experienced operators think about advisory councils and advisory boards across portfolios, when to act, how to structure them, and what actually works. My name is Udo Doring. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the Advisory Board Centre, and I'll be driving the conversation today. And I'm joined by Leonard Kaberry and Nathan Carter, both experienced operators of portfolio businesses, but also experienced managers of portfolios. So Leonard and Nathan, thank you very much for joining the conversation today. And I'm also joined by fellow director of the Advisory Board Centre, Louise Brockman, for the conversation today. And looking forward to unpacking advisory boards and advisory councils in this context. Leonard, I'm going to jump in with the first question for you. When you oversee a portfolio, what are the clear trigger points that tell you it's time to bring in an advisory council rather than waiting it out or hiring another executive?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. With the portfolio companies, it can be difficult to know when to get the right level of support or what support that you want to get. I think traditionally people have reached out to various consultants a lot, to try and fix a problem, I would say, in a small period of time. It's normally a pretty defined scope of work. And something which I think we've come to understand is that, certain businesses, whether it be looking to go into a new market, whether it be looking to expand beyond the capability of the management team, or you don't know what you don't know, having some external people that can come in for a period of time to provide genuine advice, feedback, without having a political bias to the organisation, without having to deal with the workings of the decision that will be made. Having that ability to access that experience, to access a viewpoint and a perception that is outside of what they can do, I think is valuable. And like I said, in those situations where if you get in a company who's going into a new geographic region, putting a new service line in, and they may not necessarily have done that before, or they don't know things that they may need to understand to go into that successfully. Sometimes I think also, I'll just quickly say, having an advisory council isn't a matter of binary, with or without it, you're going to succeed or not succeed. I think success is on a linear scale, and so at the end of the day, I might do it without an advisory council or without external advisors and have some success, or I might do it with advisors and have some success plus 10, 15, 20% more than I would have had. So I think that's probably a short answer for me.
Thank you. And Nathan, if I can bring you into the conversation, in practice, what's the best model for advisory support across multiple portfolio companies? Do you lean towards a shared bench of advisors, or do you look at having specific advisors or advisory councils per business within the portfolio? And have you found one model or the other works better?
Yeah, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all thing. I think it depends on the situation. So I think, my experience would tell me that it's a mix. And I think there's that benefit to having that shared bench if you have a portfolio of companies. I think that it can be helpful in helping bring those portfolio companies closer together around a central strategy. And I think it just also helps the leaders of those companies recognize there's some commonality. So having that shared bench can have a lot of benefits. But I think the challenge sometimes is the portfolio companies may have dissimilar businesses. And I think you have to have some of that subject matter expert for that specific business on the team, depending on the problem or issue that you're facing. So, the example I would think to is, say you have a oil and gas service company and then a marine construction business. they will have different subject matter experts, and a shared bench won't necessarily be able to address all of their issues or industry specific issues. So there'll be some things that it'll work for, and others I think you just have to have a bit of a read on that depending on the situation.
It's interesting, Nathan, when you look at applying quality frameworks to your advisory board structure, but still have the adaptability and the agility to make that happen. Having a fixed structure could be really problematic, couldn't it, for a portfolio?
Yeah, I exactly, Louise. I think just having that flexibility where you're able to bring in somebody that can recognize the problem you're facing. And I think, what we've seen, and Leonard can probably speak to this as well, is you have a portfolio of companies and they each have different issues or challenges that they're trying to solve. So some of them, it may be a revenue growth issue. Some of them, it may be a geographic expansion. Some, it could be even more operational, where they've stalled out on some of their operational metrics or safety targets. So, having that one team, that's a big ask to be able to solve all of those problems. And I think just having that flexibility is pretty important.
Yeah, and I would probably just add to that, Nathan, just say, from my perspective, I think, having one or two people being consistent can be very helpful, and they can be in sometimes a more generic space. There's an interesting conversation to be had that if I had a portfolio, I wanted 2 or 3 advisory councils, maybe I could get away with the same chair for all of them to have some level of consistency across how they're applied, depending on what sort of specialty the chair or necessarily brings. But maybe a senior person in the financial part, which is very more similar across the businesses as opposed to some of the subject matter experts. But I certainly think, from my perspective, having a mix of some consistency with some speciality is probably the best outcome.
Mm. Yeah, increasingly we're seeing globally that the chair is more of a generalist type function, and then you bring those specialists in. They come and go as your needs change. I think that consistency across a portfolio it has a lot of benefits. Yeah,
especially in understanding the culture you're trying to drive. Yeah. Whilst these are independent businesses, there's still going to be an overarching culture and understanding that is hard to get without having the sort of an insight into each of those.
Mm. Leonard, if I can follow on from that, how important is a consistent framework or structure within this? And I guess putting my hat on to say you've been responsible for managing portfolios. I can imagine there's a lot of loose ends in running a portfolio day to day and the moving parts. When you come to an advisory council, advisory support, is consistency something that you look for in terms of the approach? Is that something that gives you a bit of confidence that the conversations are going to happen in a certain way?
Look, and whether it's just advisory councils, we can broaden this conversation, but there's certainly, and I think the advisory board centre and the framework they put in with regards to advisory council is just taking some other best practice and putting it into a certain area. But having focused discussions, having discussions that have people that have taken the time with a framework to do the preparation to ensure that this discussion doesn't turn into another session where we all talk about what we hope something might happen and it gets, off the rails very easily. And as someone who can easily get off the rails as an individual, I certainly appreciate the notion of having a framework that has that is built upon what I would call consistent preparation or dedicated preparation through a chair, through a secretariat function, with a defined purpose and a defined time frame that you can actually focus on real problems and actually focus on outputs. Probably the last thing, I don't want to overlap maybe some other discussion, is then knowing that to be the case, the frequency of picking these advisory councils and this framework to make sure there's enough time to be able to do things and to be able to implement things, I think is also critical.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, Leonard, is just, staying away from that formulaic type approach where things just happen because they happen. What we've seen with the advisory councils is just the upfront preparation really avoids that from happening. So you have structure, but it's not a cut and paste structure. You really have to prepare for those meetings, and they're really driven by what the needs of the organization is at the time. And we've talked about, hey, there's financial or operational things that may drive that. It may also be just, what are you hiring next in the company? Do you know what the next role is you need for growth? And they can be really useful around that. So I think the structure has it's formal, but there's the flexibility around what the structure is going to be talking about each time.
Yeah, you don't want the structure from a best practice point of view to become a constraint. It's not a governance board, and you don't want it to look like one. You don't want it to behave like one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about the sort of the inputs and the framework and the structure. If we shift to outcomes, in your experience, and Nathan, I'll direct this one to you. How have you found the advisory councils impact or influence quality of decision making, and is there? Do you find that there's a blurring of lines between influence versus oversight versus management, and how do you think about that in an advisory context?
I think it can. I think you have to have that check around what is the true intent of an advisory council, and I think it's pretty easy because I think a lot of the portfolio companies get used to that governance board of directors. And so this is a really new thing for some of them. And it's easy to fall into typical board behaviors. So I think just always reminding yourself, this is not a governance board. This board is here to be a sounding board for the leaders of the organization, but at the end of the day, they're not the ones making the decision. You need to go away and decide on that as a business. So I think it's just always reminding yourself of that, and reminding that it's not a replacement for your governance.
And maybe on the back of that, Nathan, something just leading on to that, with governance boards, often you're trying to get the board to get to either a vote or a decision or a clear path forward. Often with advisory councils or boards, what we're really trying to do is challenge thought processes. We're trying to challenge each other, challenge assumptions, really help people make sure that they understand the various pathways possible, and they understand consequences and benefits, and then let them go away and say, how did this work within my company? Now, sometimes just getting access to that information is super important, which comes down to one topic we haven't really spoken to a lot about, which is the quality of the advisors you are getting. At the end of the day, the quality of the meeting, I think, comes down to a couple of things. One is the quality of the preparation, the quality of the framework, the willingness of the sponsor from the organisation, and the final part is the quality of the actual people on the board. So the selection of those advisors with whatever fit experience that they have is critical to the success of the advisory council.
And Leonard, if we can follow on to that, then what makes a good advisor, or when you're looking at that selection, what's an important factor or factors in that conversation beyond reputation? I think sometimes reputation can be the sort of the anchor point for conversations around advisors.
Well, I would say when you're selecting people to do anything, it's never an exact science, right? It's always hard to know. If anyone's ever been involved in recruiting, it's not the easiest thing to understand. However, in this process, I think there's a couple of things that help. One that's critical is fit. Can I actually work with other people in a manner that's professional? Not to be my best friend, but in a way we can share ideas and respect ideas. That's hard to get, but I think gauging that through a couple of conversations is important. How does the fit look like? Two, understanding, does their experience fit what I'm chasing? I think making sure you understand what you are chasing to make sure their experience does have some relevance. And sometimes you can be a bit out of the box with that. You don't have to always get someone right in the lane that you're in. Sometimes an adjacent industry with similar type of experience can be helpful. And probably the last thing I would say is that through this framework, the notion that I'm not tying myself to an advisor for months on end or years on end gives you some sort of flexibility to say, listen, it isn't working. We're not bound to each other for a long period of time. And that can help you be a bit more nimble and make sure that the balance of the group maintains consistent. Nathan, did you have any comments on that one?
Yeah, I'd agree, Leonard. For me, it's that blend of operating experience and I guess I'd call it shared values. So, and really no different than any team. And as we know, lots of people have great LinkedIn pages. They have great resumes. And I think until you actually sit with that person and have a discussion, and, if you're going to be pulling an advisory council together, sitting and having a meal, having a face-to-face meeting can tell you an awful lot about the fit going forward. So I really recommend that. I think the piece I would say, and Leonard's touched on it a bit, if you get the sense that the person's not going to be a fit, especially around the culture and shared values piece, then just you have to move on. It's pretty painful, I guess, at the time, but it's going to impede your ability to be effective as a group going forward. So, and like Leonard said, this isn't a long term or meant to be long term necessarily. So sometimes you got to make the decision and move on, and it'll be for the best in the end. It'll make your advisory council that much more effective.
Sorry, go ahead, Leonard.
Sorry, Louise. I was going to say maybe one last thing that's popped in my mind when Nathan was talking, just as a broader point, is sometimes you don't realise how many good quality people are out there. That there's a lot of people that in their working careers, their circles of influence, they simply don't know these people. They don't have access to the experience they actually need. And there is actually a number of people out there with significantly great experience who are willing to participate in these type of advisory councils that I think you need to make an effort to go find.
What I was going to add to that too, Leonard, is great people out there, but to manage their own expectations, that they're not sitting on a governance board or they're not part of the management team, and be really clear around those expectations, not only about their role, what they're doing and what they're not doing, but also it's never forever. So, it's easy to upset someone when they think I'm the hero in my space, and of course I'm going to be forever. So it can get tricky if you don't manage those expectations well up front. Yeah.
I think it's a good point, especially in the framework we were using, having a solid orientation with the group. And I think Nathan on the head too. We chose to try and have an orientation that overlapped with a dinner the night before to try and build a little bit of rapport, and then you can have an orientation to set expectations. I think giving yourself every chance to have the best possibility of success is important.
If we talk about, and Nathan, if I can direct this question to you, the design of the advisory councils, how do you think about advisory councils and the way that they are embedded into an organisation, and how do you keep it lightweight but high impact and balance those two factors?
I think that's a challenge depending on the organization and how it's structured, but also the changes you're trying to achieve. So I think the key to any of that is your chair and your secretariat, right? Like that will be your tie point. And I think you just have to be realistic about what you're asking from the council or the board. In terms of kind of that structure, be very specific about what you're asking them, and don't create a laundry list for that group, because I think what tend to do is you start to stray into operating the business almost when you have that big of a list of what you're trying to accomplish with the council. So I think keep it really focused, and the experienced chair and secretariat are very key. And I think that will help guide you, depending on the organization, depending on the challenges you're facing, into what the right structure is for that team.
Nathan, can I just pop in on that one? From a best practice point of view, in a portfolio, I guess different portfolio groups will approach it differently. If the sponsor is actually the investor, or is the sponsor actually the CEO of an individual business within the portfolio, have you got some thoughts about how it's best to navigate who is the sponsor in a portfolio?
Well, I think it depends. Like, there's on who the CEO is and how do they run their business. Are they just new in as a CEO? Or are they transitioning out? Is this a business that they have come into midstream, or is it something they've started from day one? So that's going to really, I think, kind of steer you towards that. I think regardless of that, the thing I would use as an overarching principle around that is just encouraging the stakeholders, including the CEO, not to operate in isolation and really be open about their lines of communication. So, and be really clear about roles and responsibilities as you start to set up the council. So, and I think that's where, I come back again to the chair of the council. They can really act as that intermediary with the CEO if they're not the sponsor, to keep them in the loop on what's going on. Because I think, if you're the CEO and looking in and you're not the sponsor, that creates some questions for you as well. And I think just keeping people in the loop and aware of the issues being discussed at the council will help alleviate some of the challenges or tension that you might see if the CEO is not the sponsor for the group.
Yeah, so we've seen so many different types of models within portfolios, whether it's controlled at the investor level and have a chair across multiple businesses, or that's reporting back to the investor versus reporting into the CEO of the individual businesses. It's I guess there are so many different ways it works, but from a best practice point of view, it does come back to that mapping too, doesn't it? Being very careful about that mapping up front.
Yes, exactly.
Can I ask, Leonard? It looks like you're about to jump in, but is there if you're thinking about design and cadence, is there a preference that you have there in terms of that mapping, where the reporting line sits, or who the sponsor is within portfolios?
I was going to, so yes, I'll answer that. I was going to comment, just like most things in life, it's not very successful generally when you have to push something onto somebody. Most people respond poorly to that in any aspect of life. If you've ever been married, you'll know that's true. And so at the end of the day, if you've got investors that want their portfolio leads or their heads to take on something, if you ultimately push it down that you must have this, and you haven't been able to convince somebody of the value of it, I don't think it's a worthwhile activity. Ultimately, you're not going to get the outcome that you really want to achieve. Now, I'm a believer that through good conversation and through explanation, you can get to a point where people understand the value of it. But fundamentally, if a leader isn't humble enough to understand that the notion of having advisors, whether that be a single advisor, which, by the way, I think there's a lot of case for a single advisor being helpful at many times, especially as an accountability partner outside the organization. If I can't get to the point where I realise this advisory council isn't a threat to me, because to me there's a difference between advisory council and governance. Governance are forced upon you. They're your employer, they're your leader, they're your person who has control by virtue of position. The advisory council is a choice. And by virtue of that choice, a strong leader needs to understand I'm getting additional advisors to support me in my role, not because I'm not capable in my role. And I think there's a lot to be said for understanding the leader strength of leadership doesn't come about to saying, if I accept external help, it means I'm no good. And I think that is a real issue. So for me, everything comes down to whoever is the sponsor of the actual or going to be, which is tricky between the investor and a CEO, but I'm more of a believer that if it's at the company level, the CEO should be bought into the process and be participating because they see value in this process. And if an investor group's trying to say, I want you to have it because we need more value, and the CEO doesn't want it, to me, that's a different discussion between the investor and the CEO, and maybe you've got the wrong people in place.
I think that's a point. No, point well made. Nathan, sorry.
Yeah, you'd mentioned cadence there. And I think that's one that, being really clear about what you're trying to achieve with the council will dictate that cadence. If you're looking at longer term strategic structural changes to the organization, a monthly cadence is probably not going to work for you. You're going to probably need that quarterly, just so the organization has time to think through what they're doing and actually make some actual changes. Versus if what you're looking at is more operational, or the issue that you're facing is more maybe dire in terms of needing to help it, then that monthly cadence will perhaps be more appropriate. But I think it's just being really, really aware of whatever you talk about as an advisory council. What do you have for horsepower within the organization to go and actually affect change that means the next time you meet, you have something to talk about and you're not just talking about the same thing again.
Yeah. Yeah, we're certainly seeing that from a research perspective too, Nathan, about advisory boards needing to be much more mindful about the outcomes and the organisation's ability to execute. That practical conversation must be happening at the advisory board table, otherwise it becomes a talk fest, right? You go, we can't actually action it. So thinking about the resource, the capability and the capacity to be able to follow through on it. And I think you're right about the time. You've got to have the advisory boards need to step out of the way to be able to enable executives to get on with it and execute on things before they meet next.
Gentlemen, I'm mindful that the examples that you're drawing on and the experience are real world experiences with vast portfolio experience, lots of moving parts, lots of different businesses, lots of different personalities, lots of different investor types. If there's a portfolio owner or investor that's listening or watching this and takes one thing from the conversation, what would you say it should be? Is there one overarching piece that you think is an important takeaway? Leonard, I might start with you.
Probably if I were to simplify it down based on the conversation we've had, what I've come to understand and what I actually believe in is that the value of external advisors to companies is real. Now, the structure, the number of people, the process, we get into all of that. But there's real value in expertise that comes from someone trusted externally who doesn't have a motivation, doesn't have a bias, that can give honest feedback and can hold people accountable in a way that within the organisation is difficult, I think is real. And so I'm a really big believer of looking to do that at various company levels, from a small company to a large company, from individual external to a group of 5 to a group of 3, whatever that looks like. I really believe that external advisors have a bigger part to play in helping companies succeed.
Nathan, anything from you?
Yeah, I thought a little bit about this, Udo, and I'm going to give you a double for the money because I couldn't come up with one. Okay. So
I'll take it.
But for me, I think the first one is you're going to form a council and don't try and boil the ocean. So, be specific on the issue or challenge you want the advisory council to work on. And, I think the council, make sure that it's important to the business at that point in time. So the example is working on a long-term strategic plan as a council, when that company may have immediate cash flow issues, that's not the right thing for the council to be working on. So really think long and hard about what task you're going to get the council working towards. And then as you form that council, to me, it's about culture and fit. There's going to be a lot of advisors that look good on paper. They have tons of relevant experience. And when you get together with them, you realize they're not a fit for the team's culture or shared values, and there's going to be unnecessary friction, then don't bring them on. It doesn't mean that everybody has to agree, but there has to be that shared values in terms of how they work together, how they're respectful of the others on the team. So those would be the two in my mind.
Thank you. I think that's well said, and really important aspects of it. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for engaging in this conversation. I think having known you in professional capacities and seeing the work that you do, this conversation certainly comes from a place of experience, and we're hugely appreciative of the fact that you're willing to share some of those insights and experiences. So, Leonard, Nathan, thank you very much. Louise, as always, lovely to have you in the conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next Advisor Insights conversations. Thank you.